She didn't leave because he forgot their anniversary. She left because it was the 1,000th time she realized she had become invisible. No marriage breaks in a single evening. It breaks quietly, inside countless ordinary moments, when one heart keeps waiting to be noticed, and the other never realizes it has stopped looking. For 8 years, Queen Isabella Everwin stood beside Alpha King Ronan Blackthorn. The history books would later praise Ronan as one of the greatest rulers the Alpha Kingdom had ever known. They celebrated the prosperous harvests, the peaceful borders, the thriving villages, the roads that connected distant packs, the hospitals that never turned away the poor. Few people knew where those victories truly began. Every winter, when famine threatened the western villages, it was Isabella who quietly met with farmers, merchants, and millers, until every family had enough grain. Every spring, when rivers flooded southern farmlands, she organized rescue teams before the first royal decree was ever written. Whenever rival alphas argued over territory, she invited their wives to tea. Peace often began around her table long before it reached Ronan's council chamber. She never wanted applause. Watching children eat, families return home safely, and soldiers come back from wars that never happened, was enough. At least, it used to be. In the early years of their marriage, Ronan noticed everything. He thanked her after every council meeting. He asked for her opinion before signing important treaties. Sometimes he would arrive at her study late at night, carrying 2 cups of tea. "I can't solve this without you." He would smile. She believed they ruled together, not because they shared a throne, because they shared each other. But kingdoms grow. Responsibilities multiply. Council meetings become longer. Problems become heavier. Without either of them noticing, gratitude slowly became expectation. Expectation quietly became routine. Routine eventually became silence. Now, Ronan no longer asked, "What do you think?" He simply assumed the reports waiting on his desk each morning would already contain every answer he needed. They always did, because Isabella made sure they did. He no longer thanked her for remembering every ambassador's birthday, or for noticing which villages needed extra medicine before winter arrived, or for staying awake after midnight, reviewing tax records so innocent families would never pay more than they should. He didn't mean to stop appreciating her. He simply stopped noticing the thousands of invisible things she quietly carried every day. Their 8th wedding anniversary arrived with the first snowfall. For once, Isabella decided not to spend the evening reading council reports. Instead, she prepared dinner herself. Not because the palace cooks weren't capable, because Ronan always loved the meals she made before either of them wore crowns. She roasted rosemary lamb, baked fresh honey bread, prepared blackberry tarts using the last berries from the palace gardens. She even found the old blue dress Ronan once said made her eyes look like the summer sky. The dining room glowed with candlelight. Fresh white roses filled crystal vases. Everything was ready before sunset. She smiled as she looked toward the great wooden doors. "He'll be surprised," she whispered. Hours passed. The soup grew cold. The bread hardened. Outside, snow covered the palace gardens. Inside, the candles slowly burned lower. Servants quietly offered to clear the table. Each time Isabella smiled gently. "No, he'll be here soon." Midnight arrived. The final candle flickered weakly. At last, the dining room doors opened. Ronan stepped inside, carrying a stack of council documents beneath one arm. His cloak was dusted with snow. He looked exhausted. He smiled when he saw her. "I'm sorry." The Northern Trade delegation stayed longer than expected. He kissed her forehead absent-mindedly, then picked up one of the reports. "I'm completely exhausted. We'll celebrate next year." Without waiting for her answer, he walked past the beautifully prepared table, past the cold meal she had spent hours preparing, past the flowers, past the woman who had quietly spent 8 years making both his life and his kingdom easier. He disappeared into his study. The door clicked shut. Silence settled over the dining room. Isabella remained standing beside the untouched table. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Not because he had forgotten their anniversary, but because she finally understood something her heart had been trying to tell her for years. She wasn't waiting for one special evening anymore. She was waiting to be seen. And somewhere along the way, the man she loved had stopped looking. Before the last candle burned out, Queen Isabella quietly made a decision that would change both their lives and the fate of an entire kingdom. Before dawn, while the palace still slept beneath a blanket of snow, Queen Isabella Everwin quietly walked through the halls she had called home for 8 years. She did not cry. She had done enough of that already. The tears had come during missed dinners, unfinished conversations, birthdays shortened by council meetings, anniversaries postponed until next year. This morning, there were none left, only peace. She entered the royal bedchamber one last time. Ronan still slept soundly. The reports from the previous night remained scattered across his desk. One page had slipped onto the floor. Without thinking, she bent down and placed it neatly back with the others. The habit made her smile sadly. Even now, she was still making his life easier. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked younger when he slept. Less like a king, more like the man who had once stood beneath an oak tree and nervously asked her to marry him. She remembered the promise he had whispered that day. No matter how busy life becomes, I'll always make time for us. He had meant it. She never doubted that. Life had simply happened one tomorrow at a time. She stepped closer, brushed a stray lock of hair away from his forehead, then quietly whispered, "I hope someday you notice what's missing." He never stirred. She packed almost nothing. A simple traveling dress, a warm cloak, her mother's worn journal, a small pouch of herbs, enough coins to begin again somewhere no one knew her name. Everything else remained exactly where it belonged. The jeweled necklaces, the embroidered gowns, the royal seal. Even the Luna crown rested untouched upon its velvet stand. She studied it for a moment. "It was never the crown," she murmured softly. "That gave me purpose." She turned away. There was no farewell letter, not because she had nothing to say, because she had spent years saying it already. "Can we have dinner together tonight? Do you have a moment? I've missed you. Can we talk?" Each request had received the same answer. Tomorrow, a letter would simply become one more conversation waiting to be read later. She no longer wanted later. She wanted peace. The head housekeeper, Martha, was already awake, preparing breakfast, when she saw Isabella walking toward the eastern gate. "My queen," she hurried over. "You're dressed for travel." Isabella smiled gently. "I am. Will your majesty be joining you?" She slowly shook her head. "No." Understanding slowly settled across Martha's face. She had watched this marriage from the beginning. She had seen the empty chairs at dinner, the untouched birthday cakes, the countless evenings Isabella quietly ate alone while the king remained inside the council chamber. Tears filled the older woman's eyes. "Can I do anything?" "You already have." Isabella reached for her hands. "You've always been kind." Martha's voice trembled. "Will you come back?" Isabella looked toward the palace one final time. The morning sun touched its towers with gold. It was beautiful, but beauty alone could not make a place feel like home. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But wherever I go, I hope I remember who I was before I became invisible." Martha embraced her tightly. Neither woman spoke. Some goodbyes were too heavy for words. Hours later, Ronan entered the breakfast room. His favorite tea waited exactly where it always did. The morning reports had already been organized by priority. His schedule was perfectly arranged. Everything looked normal. He smiled to himself. Even after forgetting their anniversary, Isabella had still taken care of everything. He assumed she was sleeping late. "Has the Queen had breakfast?" he asked casually. Martha lowered her eyes. "No, Your Majesty." "Still asleep?" A long silence followed. Finally, she whispered, "I don't believe the Queen is coming back." Ronan frowned. "What do you mean?" "She left before sunrise." He blinked once, then smiled faintly. "She probably needs a few days." Martha said nothing, because she knew something the king did not. Women rarely leave because of one terrible night. They leave after silently surviving hundreds of lonely ones. Ronan picked up his reports. "There are council meetings all week. I'm sure she'll be home before they're finished." He walked toward the throne room without another thought. Behind him, the palace somehow felt different. Nothing had changed. Everything was exactly where it had always been, except for the one person whose quiet presence had made the entire palace feel alive. And for the first time in 8 years, the Queen's chair at breakfast remained empty. For the first week, nothing seemed different. The Royal Council met as scheduled. Trade caravans continued arriving through the eastern gates. Taxes were collected. Royal decrees were signed. Whenever anyone asked about the Queen, Ronan answered with an easy smile. "She needed a little time. I expect she'll return soon." The ministers nodded politely. No one questioned the king. But Martha noticed something no one else did. Every evening, an extra place was still set at the royal dining table. Every morning, fresh flowers continued appearing in the Queen's empty chambers. The palace had not yet accepted that Isabella was truly gone. Neither had Ronan. Then the first problem appeared. A grain shipment bound for the western villages never arrived. The royal treasurer entered the council chamber, looking uneasy. "The wagons left the capital 6 days ago. They've vanished." Ronan frowned. "Send another shipment." "We already have." The treasurer hesitated. "There isn't another." Silence settled over the chamber. "What do you mean?" "The emergency grain reserve is empty." Ronan looked up sharply. "Impossible. The reserve has always been full." The treasurer lowered his eyes. "It was. But no one reordered supplies after the autumn harvest." Ronan rubbed his forehead. "Who was responsible for that?" The answer came quietly. "The Queen." 2 days later, another report arrived. The Merchant Guild of the Southern Coast had suspended trade negotiations. They say the annual agreements were never renewed. Ronan frowned. "I signed those every year." The Chancellor carefully corrected him. "No, Your Majesty. You signed the final copies. Her Majesty handled every negotiation before they reached your desk." Before the council had finished discussing that problem, a messenger rushed into the throne room. "The Northern Pack has withdrawn from next month's peace summit." "Why?" "They say," the young wolf swallowed nervously, "they've received no letters from Queen Isabella." Ronan stared at him. "What does that have to do with the summit?" The messenger looked confused. "Everything. Their Luna only trusted agreements, personally discussed with Her Majesty." The reports multiplied. Hospitals requested emergency medicine. The inventory system had collapsed. No one knew which villages needed supplies first. Engineers halted construction on 2 major bridges. Funding approvals had never arrived. 3 orphanages announced they would close within the month. Their anonymous benefactor had disappeared. Ronan couldn't understand it. One queen had left. Why did the entire kingdom suddenly seem unable to function? Late one evening, Chancellor Edmund Vale entered the king's study, carrying 12 enormous leather ledgers. Each was worn with age. Each was filled with meticulous handwriting. "Your Majesty, I believe it's time." Ronan looked up from the growing pile of unfinished reports. "What are those?" "The Queen's records. I've seen them before." The Chancellor gently shook his head. "No, you've seen the summaries. These," he placed the first ledger on the desk, "are the originals." Ronan opened it. Every page contained Isabella's careful notes, harvest projections, merchant contracts, diplomatic correspondence, village inspections, flood prevention plans, scholarship lists, charitable donations. Beside nearly every proposal, another page documented its successful completion. He opened the second ledger, then the third, the fourth. Everywhere he looked, there was Isabella. Not in grand speeches, not in public ceremonies, in the quiet details no one else had ever noticed. The chancellor watched him silently. Finally he spoke. "Do you remember the Great Famine?" Ronan nodded. "We survived it better than any neighboring kingdom, because Her Majesty convinced 37 merchants to lower grain prices before shortages began. I never knew." "I know. What about the peace treaty with the Western clans?" "The Queen spent 11 months earning the trust of their elders." Ronan looked stunned. "I thought that treaty was negotiated in a single meeting." Edmund smiled sadly. "The meeting lasted one afternoon. The trust took nearly a year." One by one, every success Ronan had proudly believed belonged to his reign revealed another story. A quieter one, a truer one. At last, the chancellor closed the final ledger. "Your Majesty." The Queen was never standing behind the throne. He rested one weathered hand upon the stack of books. She was quietly holding it together. Ronan stared at the ledgers until the words blurred before his eyes. For the first time, he understood the terrible truth. He had not lost a helper. He had lost the invisible foundation beneath everything he believed he had built. And somewhere beyond the southern mountains, the only person who knew how to restore it was no longer waiting for him to notice she was gone. Far beyond the southern mountains, no one knew Isabella Everwin had once worn a crown. The people of the Green River Valley knew her by only one name: Bella, the quiet woman who smiled more than she spoke, the stranger who had arrived one spring morning carrying a single travel bag, a worn journal, and enough determination to begin again. When she first reached the valley, it looked forgotten. The old watermill beside the river had long since collapsed. Children walked nearly 3 hours to attend the nearest school. The closest physician lived 2 villages away. Most families survived only by selling raw wool for almost nothing to wealthy merchants who dictated unfair prices. Everyone believed the valley was too small to matter. Bella looked around and saw possibility. She rented the abandoned mill for almost no money. The roof leaked whenever it rained. The windows rattled during every storm. The floorboards creaked beneath every step. To most people, it looked like another ruined building. Bella smiled the first time she walked through it. "It has good bones." The elderly landlord chuckled. "People have been saying that for 20 years. She rolled up her sleeves. "Then perhaps it's finally time someone proved them right." She spent the following weeks repairing it herself. Farmers stopped to help. Children carried buckets of paint. Carpenters donated scraps of wood. By the end of summer, the old mill had become the valley's first school. The first morning, only 6 children arrived. Bella welcomed each one as though 100 had come. She taught reading in the mornings, mathematics after lunch, history before sunset. But her favorite lessons weren't written inside books. "What makes a good leader?" she asked one afternoon. A little boy answered proudly, "The strongest person." Bella smiled. "What if someone stronger arrives tomorrow?" The children grew quiet. A little girl slowly raised her hand. "The one who helps everyone." Bella's eyes warmed. "I think that's a wonderful answer." Soon another problem demanded attention. Several elderly villagers could no longer travel to distant towns for medical care. Bella wrote letters to healers across the region. Most never replied. One finally did. An elderly physician named Dr. Miriam arrived carrying 2 battered medicine chests. "You must be Bella." "I am. I've heard strange stories." Bella laughed softly. "What kind?" "That one woman is trying to build an entire community." Bella looked around the valley. I was hoping people might help. Dr. Miriam smiled. I think they already have. Within 2 years, the abandoned mill had become much more than a school. A small clinic stood beside it. A weaving workshop employed dozens of widows who once struggled to feed their families. Bella organized trading cooperatives so local farmers could sell directly to neighboring towns instead of depending on dishonest middlemen. Profits doubled, then tripled. Families repaired their homes. Children stayed in school. Young people stopped leaving the valley in search of work. Hope quietly returned. Not because Bella gave people success, because she helped them discover they could build it themselves. Sometimes, late in the evening, Bella sat beside the river, watching the current drift peacefully toward the sea. She still thought about Ronan. Not with anger, not even with sadness, only gratitude for the years that had once been beautiful. She hoped he was healthy. She hoped the kingdom was thriving. She no longer wondered whether he missed her. That question had finally stopped controlling her heart. For the first time in many years, her happiness no longer depended on whether someone noticed everything she quietly did. The river noticed. The children whose laughter filled the old mill noticed. The families whose tables held enough food each winter noticed. That was enough. 5 years passed. The forgotten Green River Valley became one of the most prosperous communities on the continent. Merchants traveled for days just to study its thriving workshops and irrigation systems. Scholars came to observe its schools. Farmers came to learn new techniques. People searching for hope always seemed to leave carrying a little more than when they arrived. Many asked who governed such an extraordinary place. The villagers always answered with quiet pride, "We don't have a queen. We have Bella." Far away, the worst drought in generations spread across the continent. Harvests failed, rivers dried, entire kingdoms faced starvation. Only one valley continued producing enough grain to feed thousands, and its quiet leader had no idea that the man who once failed to see her was finally on his way. The drought spared no kingdom. Fields that had once rippled with golden grain lay cracked beneath an unforgiving sun. Rivers shrank into narrow streams. Fruit trees withered before harvest. One desperate messenger after another arrived at the Alpha Palace carrying the same reports. Food shortages, empty wells, starving villages. For the first time in decades, the Alpha Kingdom was forced to ask neighboring lands for help. Most had nothing to spare. Then the royal chancellor unfolded a single map across the council table. Every region was marked in red, except one. A small green valley beyond the southern mountains. Green River Valley. Its reservoirs were still full. Its harvests remained abundant. Its people had somehow turned a devastating drought into little more than an inconvenience. Ronan frowned. Who governs this place? The chancellor smiled faintly. The people call her the Lady of the River. No title, no noble rank, just a woman whose reputation had quietly spread across the continent. The chancellor hesitated before adding, "Her given name is Bella." Something stirred in Ronan's chest. He couldn't explain why. 3 days later, the king rode into Green River Valley with only a small escort. He expected to find a wealthy estate, a grand manor, perhaps even a local ruler surrounded by servants. Instead, he found laughter. Children raced barefoot through freshly watered orchards. Farmers worked side by side, repairing irrigation canals. Women loaded wagons with sacks of grain destined for drought-stricken villages. No one looked desperate. Everyone looked busy and hopeful. An elderly farmer pointed toward the river. "You're looking for Bella?" Ronan nodded. "She'll be down there. She always is." He followed the sound of rushing water. There, standing knee-deep in a muddy irrigation channel, was Isabella. She wore worn leather boots. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows. A streak of mud crossed one cheek. She was laughing. Actually laughing. Beside her, a group of farmers struggled to lift a heavy wooden floodgate into place. Push together, Bella called. Not harder, smarter. The farmers adjusted their footing. The gate slid perfectly into position. Water rushed through the new channel, flowing toward dry fields farther down the valley. Cheers erupted. One young boy threw his cap into the air. "We did it!" Bella laughed. "No, we did." She noticed Ronan only when the crowd slowly grew quiet. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. 5 years vanished between them. He expected anger, bitterness, coldness. Instead, she simply smiled. A gentle, familiar smile. "Hello, Ronan." He swallowed hard. "Hello, Ronan." Isabella. The name felt strangely formal now. The villagers looked between them with growing curiosity. Bella wiped the mud from her hands. "Everyone, this is an old friend." No one questioned her. The farmers greeted him warmly before returning to work. To them, he wasn't the Alpha King. He was simply someone Bella knew. Later that afternoon, she walked with him through the valley. Children waved as they passed. Merchants stopped to thank her for helping expand their businesses. A young mother introduced Bella to her newborn daughter. "We named her Isabella," she said proudly, "because you taught us what hope looks like." Bella looked embarrassed. "You gave yourselves hope. I only helped." Ronan watched the exchange in silence. At the palace, people bowed because he wore a crown. Here, people loved Bella because she had changed their lives. There was no ceremony, no throne, no royal authority, only quiet respect earned one person at a time. He realized something that hurt more than any accusation ever could. She looked happier than she had ever been as queen, not because she had stopped loving him, because she had finally stopped waiting to be noticed. That evening, as the sun settled over fields that still shimmered with green despite the drought, Ronan understood that he had not come merely to ask for help saving his kingdom. He had come face to face with the life Isabella had built after discovering she no longer needed his recognition to know her own worth. And for the first time, he wondered whether he deserved even a place within it. That evening, the valley grew quiet. The farmers returned home. Lanterns glowed warmly inside cottages. Crickets sang beside the river that had given the valley its name. Bella sat on the porch of the old mill, now surrounded by gardens and children's drawings hanging from its windows. Ronan joined her, carrying 2 cups of herbal tea. For a while, they simply listened to the water. It reminded him of another life, a slower one they had once promised to build together after the kingdom finally found peace. The kingdom had found peace. They never had. He handed her a cup. She accepted it with a quiet smile. "Thank you." "I remembered," he said softly. "You always preferred mint tea in the evenings." She looked down at the steaming cup. "You remembered." There was no accusation in her voice, only surprise. The silence between them stretched gently, not uncomfortable, just honest. Finally, Ronan spoke. "There has been one question haunting me for 5 years." She looked toward the river. "I know." He drew a slow breath. "Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy?" Bella smiled. A sad, gentle smile. "I did." He frowned. "When?" She turned to face him. "Every anniversary you forgot. Every dinner that grew cold. Every conversation you postponed. Every morning I asked if we could spend a little time together." She looked into his eyes. "And every time you answered, 'Tomorrow.'" The word settled between them like a stone. Ronan lowered his head. He remembered saying it countless times. Tomorrow, after the council meeting, after the trade negotiations, after the harvest reports, after the next crisis. There was always another tomorrow. Bella continued quietly. "You thought I left because of one forgotten anniversary." She gently shook her head. "I didn't. I left because that night finally helped me understand something." He whispered. "What?" I had stopped expecting you to notice me." Her honesty hurt far more than anger would have. She wasn't trying to punish him. She was simply telling the truth. "You loved me," she said softly. "I never questioned that. You worked tirelessly for the kingdom. You carried burdens most people will never understand." She reached toward the field stretching beyond the river. "But somewhere along the way, you started treating me like the kingdom." Ronan looked confused. "What do you mean? You assumed I would always be there. No matter how many times you postponed us. No matter how often I waited. You trusted my love." She smiled sadly. "So much that you stopped caring for it." His eyes filled with tears. Because every word was true. He had never chosen the kingdom over Isabella. He had simply convinced himself there would always be more time for her later. He had mistaken permanence for permission. Bella looked toward the stars, beginning to appear overhead. People think hearts break because of one terrible moment. They usually don't. They break quietly, one ordinary disappointment at a time. She laughed softly. "Do you know what finally frightened me?" He shook his head. "I realized, if I disappeared for a week, I wasn't sure you'd notice until someone mentioned it at breakfast." Ronan closed his eyes. The memory struck him with unbearable clarity. The morning she had left, he had believed she was simply sleeping late. His chest tightened. "I failed you. You neglected us," she corrected gently. "There's a difference." He looked at her in surprise. "You weren't cruel. You weren't unfaithful. You weren't unkind." She smiled. "You were just always somewhere else." The truth was almost unbearable, because it contained no villain. Only two people, one giving more than she realized, the other taking more than he ever intended. After a long silence, Ronan finally whispered, "I'm not going to ask you to come home." Bella looked at him. "Not yet." He smiled sadly. "I think I need to learn what home actually means first." For the first time that evening, her smile reached her eyes, and somewhere deep inside her heart, a door she had believed was permanently closed opened just a little. Ronan did not leave the valley the next morning, or the morning after that. The members of his royal escort waited 3 days before finally asking, "Your Majesty, when do we return to the capital?" Ronan looked toward the fields where farmers were already beginning their work. "You do." The captain blinked. "And you?" "I'll stay." The soldiers exchanged confused glances. "The kingdom needs its king." Ronan smiled faintly. "The kingdom has needed a better man for a long time." He handed the captain a sealed letter. "Tell Chancellor Edmund to govern in my absence. If there's an emergency, he knows where to find me." With that, the Alpha King removed the jeweled clasp from his royal cloak. He folded the cloak carefully, then handed it to the captain. "For now, I won't be needing this." The valley did not treat him like a king. It treated him like everyone else. On his first morning, Elder Thomas placed a shovel in his hands. The eastern irrigation ditch collapsed during the night. Ronan looked at the tool. "I've never repaired one." Thomas grinned. "Then today you'll learn." By noon, Ronan's hands were blistered. Mud covered his boots. His back ached in ways sword training had never prepared him for. When he stopped to catch his breath, Thomas chuckled. "Tired already?" Ronan laughed. "I negotiated a border dispute with 3 rival alphas. This is somehow harder." The old farmer winked. "Because the ditch doesn't care who you are." Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Ronan rose before sunrise with the farmers. He repaired fences after storms, helped harvest wheat beneath the summer sun, carried sacks of grain alongside young laborers who had no idea how many royal decrees bore his signature. He taught children to read beneath the old oak tree outside Bella's school. At first, the children found him intimidating. Then they discovered he made funny voices while reading adventure stories. Soon, they competed for the chance to sit beside him. One afternoon, a little boy tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Ronan, what's your job?" He opened his mouth automatically. "I'm—" Then he stopped. He smiled. "I'm still figuring that out." The children laughed. "So are we." Bella watched quietly. She noticed things Ronan never realized. He no longer looked at the sky while people spoke to him. He looked at them. He remembered names. He listened to stories without checking the time. When an elderly widow mentioned her roof leaked, he repaired it before the next rainstorm. No one asked him to. He simply remembered. One evening, Bella found him helping an old shepherd carry firewood. "You could have asked someone else," she said. He shrugged. "I was already walking this way." She smiled knowingly. "No. You noticed." He looked at the bundle of wood in his arms, then back at her. For the first time, he understood the compliment hidden inside those two simple words. Nearly a year passed. The drought finally ended. Rain returned to the valley. The fields shimmered green once more. On the first morning of spring, Ronan walked with Bella beside the river where she had rebuilt her life. He reached into his pocket. There was no royal proclamation, no jeweled necklace, no elaborate ceremony. Only a simple silver ring crafted by the valley blacksmith. He held it out. "The first time I asked you to marry me, I asked you to stand beside my throne." His voice was steady. This time, he looked directly into her eyes. "I'm asking whether I may spend the rest of my life standing beside you." Bella's eyes filled with tears, not because of the ring, because she finally believed the man before her understood the difference. He wasn't asking her to return to the life she had left. He was asking to build a new one together. She slipped the ring onto her finger. Only on one condition. He smiled. "Anything." She gently took his hand. "We never postpone today for another tomorrow." Emotion caught in his throat. He nodded. "I've already learned what tomorrow can cost." Together, they stood beside the river as the morning sun rose over the valley. Not as the king and queen they once had been, but as two people who had finally discovered that love is not sustained by grand promises. It is protected, one ordinary day at a time. When Ronan and Isabella returned to the capital, the people filled every street. Word had spread for days that their queen was coming home. Not because the king had commanded it, because she had chosen it. There were no elaborate parades, no military procession. Instead, farmers lined the roads carrying baskets of grain. Teachers stood with their students. Healers gathered in white robes outside the palace gates. Widows held flowers in their hands. They welcomed not only their queen, but the woman who had quietly changed countless lives long before anyone thought to thank her. Isabella smiled at every familiar face. She recognized names, remembered children who were now grown, asked elderly villagers about their health. Nothing about her had changed, only the way people finally saw her. The royal council assembled the following morning. Every minister expected Ronan to resume ruling exactly as before. Instead, the king carried only a single notebook into the council chamber. He took his seat, then looked toward Isabella. "Before we begin, I have something to say." The room fell silent. "For years, I believed leadership meant having the right answers." He smiled faintly. "I've learned it begins with asking better questions." He turned toward Isabella. "What are we missing?" Several ministers exchanged surprised glances. The king had never opened a council meeting that way. Isabella unfolded her own notes. "The eastern villages still lack physicians. Our veterans need permanent rehabilitation centers. And rural schools require more teachers before winter." Ronan wrote every point into his notebook. No pride, no embarrassment, only gratitude. From that day forward, every major royal decision carried both their signatures. Not because protocol required it, because partnership did. The changes reached far beyond the palace. Ronan introduced a new tradition known throughout the kingdom as the Day of Listening. Once every month, the king, queen, ministers, judges, and military commanders left the capital. No speeches, no ceremonies. They simply visited ordinary people. They worked in farms, shared meals with families, listened to merchants, visited hospitals, read stories in village schools. No official decisions could be made that day. Its only purpose was to listen. One young advisor asked, "How can listening be considered royal work?" Ronan smiled. "It became the most important work I ever learned." Isabella reshaped the palace as well. The royal dining room, once used only for formal banquets, became sacred family time. No council meetings, no political discussions, no reports. Every evening, the palace bells rang at sunset. Wherever Ronan happened to be, he returned home. The ministers quickly learned a simple truth. If a meeting could wait until tomorrow, it would. If it could not, they solved it before dinner. The kingdom did not collapse. In many ways, it became stronger, because a rested king made wiser decisions, and a queen who felt seen continued offering the quiet wisdom that had always guided the realm. Years later, visitors often asked why the Alpha Kingdom seemed unusually peaceful. Some expected secret military strategies. Others assumed it was economic prosperity. The chancellor always smiled before answering. Our greatest reform wasn't financial. It wasn't political. It was personal. He would gesture toward the palace gardens. There, almost every evening, the king and queen could be seen walking together before sunset. Talking, laughing, sometimes saying nothing at all. Simply choosing each other's company before the demands of the crown. The people understood what that simple walk represented. A kingdom flourishes when the hearts leading it are cared for as faithfully as the land itself. Together, Ronan and Isabella rebuilt roads, expanded schools, strengthened trade, protected villages. But their greatest achievement was quieter than any monument. They created a kingdom where success was no longer measured only by prosperous harvests or peaceful borders. It was measured by whether the people who stood beside one another felt seen. 40 years later, young rulers no longer studied the year of the empty throne as a political crisis. They studied it as the year a marriage almost disappeared. Inside the Royal Academy, future kings and queens gathered each spring to hear the story from the people who had lived it, not from historians, from Ronan and Isabella themselves. The students expected lessons about diplomacy, military strategy, economic reform. Instead, they heard stories about missed dinners, forgotten anniversaries, conversations postponed until tomorrow. One young prince raised his hand. "Your Majesty, what was the greatest mistake you ever made?" The old king smiled sadly. "I believed love was patient enough to wait forever." The students became silent. "I was wrong." He looked toward Isabella. "The people who love us most don't usually leave because of one terrible day. They leave after countless ordinary days, when they begin believing they no longer matter." Every student wrote those words down, not because they were spoken by a king, because they were painfully true. Isabella's hair had turned silver, but every Wednesday morning, she still visited village schools. She read stories to children, shared meals with teachers, asked young students about their dreams. One little girl looked up at her one afternoon. "Were you always a queen?" Isabella laughed softly. "No, I was once a woman who forgot she deserved to be seen." The child tilted her head. "What changed?" Isabella smiled. "I remembered. And then, the people who loved me learned to remember too." Ronan never began a council meeting the same way he once had. Before discussing treaties, before reviewing military reports, before hearing petitions, he always sought out Isabella. Sometimes she was in the palace gardens, sometimes reading in the library, sometimes helping prepare meals for charity kitchens. Wherever she was, he paused, took her hand, looked into her eyes, and asked the same question. How are you today? He already knew the answer mattered, not because he feared losing her again, because he finally understood that attention is one of the purest forms of love. The ministers noticed, the servants noticed. Eventually, the entire kingdom noticed. Soon families across the realm adopted a similar tradition. No matter how busy life became, they made time each day to ask one another a simple question. How are you? Not while walking away, not while reading reports, not while thinking about tomorrow, but while truly listening to the answer. Above the entrance to the royal council hall, the inscription Isabella chose remained untouched by time. People rarely leave because of one terrible day. They leave after countless ordinary days in which they no longer feel seen. Travelers often stop to read those words. Some smiled knowingly. Others stood quietly for a long time before continuing on their journey. Many returned home and hugged the people waiting for them. On the evening of their 50th wedding anniversary, Ronan and Isabella sat together beneath the same oak tree where he had first asked her to marry him. This time, there were no grand celebrations, no royal orchestra, no elaborate feast, just 2 cups of mint tea, the same tea he had remembered to bring her all those years ago in the valley. Ronan looked at the fading sunset. Do you know something? She smiled. What? I used to think saving the kingdom was the greatest thing we ever did. And now? He squeezed her hand gently. I think learning how to truly see you saved both the kingdom and me. Isabella rested her head against his shoulder. The evening breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Somewhere in the palace gardens, children laughed as they chased one another through the grass. The sound filled the quiet with hope. History remembered Ronan as a wise king. It remembered Isabella as a remarkable queen. But those who knew their story best remembered something even more important. A thriving kingdom was never built by crowns alone. It was built by 2 people who learned that love is not protected by extraordinary moments. It is protected every day by choosing to notice the quiet heart standing faithfully beside you.